Hi, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Mishi, and I'm a bookseller here at P&P, where we host a wide range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones. And when we reach the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone by this pillar to ask your questions. Tonight, I'm honored to welcome Soraya Chemaly, celebrating the release of her new book, All We Want Is Everything: How We Dismantle Male Supremacy. As a human rights researcher who specializes in gender equity initiatives, and as a woman, I am especially grateful to introduce this conversation. It's easy to imagine male supremacy as something that lifts men up and holds everyone else down. But as Chemaly makes clear, and as our current moment keeps reminding us, the fallout is far more complicated. Male supremacy reaches beyond gender. It doesn't just shape our intimate or interpersonal relationships. It reverberates through our politics, our institutions, and the world we share. And as Bell Hooks reminds us, patriarchy has no gender. Chemaly begins from a stark premise: that the 2024 reelection of Donald Trump made something impossible to ignore, that male supremacy is not a fringe ideology or an outdated relic, but a deeply entrenched value system shaping American politics, culture, and democratic life. To look away from that reality, she argues, is to misunderstand the root causes of the social and political turmoil unfolding across the Western world and to undermine our ability to resist it. In All We Want Is Everything, Chemaly offers not only a diagnosis, but a path forward, one that imagines a more equitable future for people of all genders and for democracy itself. Soraya Chemaly is an award-winning writer and activist whose work centers on the role of gender in culture, politics, religion, and the media. She is the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project and a leading advocate for women's freedom of expression and civic engagement. Her writing appears in Time, The Guardian, The Nation, The Atlantic, The Verge, HuffPost, and many other outlets. And Chemaly will be joined in conversation by Rachel Louise Snyder, author of Fugitive Denim, What We've Lost Is Nothing, the groundbreaking No Visible Bruises, and the award-winning memoir, Women We Buried, Women We Burned. A 2021 Guggenheim Fellow, Snyder has spent more than 2 decades reporting on human rights, gender-based violence, war, displacement, and global inequality. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, and on NPR. Please join me in welcoming Soraya Chemaly and Rachel Louise Snyder.
I know. Every time I get in these chairs, I'm like, ooh, it's very wobbly.
Convinced I'm going to fall.
I know. Hello. This is very exciting.
It is exciting.
I'm so happy to be here on a Friday night. I am ever the professor, so I've got my notes and my pen and my everything. Thank you for having me, and thank you for writing this book. Okay, I'm just gonna hold it on my lap. No, it's fine. It's all right. I'm a multitasker.
You are a multitasker.
Wow, way to get right into it, Snyder. Okay, so I would like to open up with a question that sort of addresses all of your work and the moment that we're in. Many of you maybe haven't heard what happened yesterday in the tranche of emails that was released. There's this guy named Epstein. You probably never heard of him. No. I wonder, you've talked about this a lot. You and I have both talked about it. I'm writing about this right now for my overlords. Could you talk a little bit about what this latest release is? Because I think there's a difference between knowing, that Casablanca, like, gambling, there's gambling going on here, whatever that famous line is. There's a difference between knowing, and then there's a difference between seeing the actual language in print. And I just wonder if you could respond to...
I think we might differ.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think it matters to see it in print.
Ooh, interesting.
I don't think any of it matters because we know what we need to know about how bad things are. And we know how many people and institutions were complicit and profited. And so I don't feel that it matters. I don't even feel that photographs that we could prove were real matter. You know, I mean, we have a photograph of Epstein holding a check, a large check, like a, you know, like a prop. And it basically indicates that he had sold a marked down girl to Trump. And it was just part of the humor of the environment. But we want this bad man, right? Because bad men make good men look better, among other things. But we want the bad man so we don't have to think about the systems and our complicity. We don't have to think about the banks and the law firms and the professors and the tech billionaires and the women that were enablers. And so I think that's why do you think the seeing it matters?
I think in a way, your answer contained the reason for me, which is that there's a difference between like, oh my God, they're money launderers, and here is a visual of a check that is given. And it might just be the writer in me that I'm like, I tell my students, like, you've got to have load-bearing details.
Right, but we have a kind of Venn diagram, because I referenced the check, which is what your point is.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter.
Yes, yes.
Right?
I mean,
like
I
it,
don't.
like it's this. Like I think we could have it in Times Square on a big screen,
Right.
and it wouldn't matter, because I don't think people care. If they cared, then we wouldn't be here. Because when he said "grab them by the pussy,"
Right,
we
I
would
know.
have just
Yeah.
said goodbye.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
when he said, you know, I mean, there are decades of things he
Hang
said.
Mike Pence. We would have.
Yes,
I know,
there's like
any
many
number of
decades of
Yeah.
things that he said
Yeah.
along the way.
Yeah.
And so I just think we're in this moment where, even more than any other time, the lack of care about what happens to young girls is part of a bigger system of not really caring what happens to what powerful people do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's very aspirational, particularly in American culture, to want to be the powerful person.
Yeah, I mean, in the mattering, I don't think it will change anything. I don't think anything will happen to our leaders, but I think it may speak to people who are on the fence. It may speak to people
anyone be on the fence?
I don't know. Even as I
like,
said it,
what fence?
even as
are
I
they,
said it, I was like,
what fence are they sitting on?
Yeah.
You know, I just don't get it.
I mean, yeah, I think about people. Well, okay, I don't want to go into a rabbit hole. I was just going to say, I was going to name names.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, no, I think about people like, okay, well, this is DC. It's a friendly crowd. I think about people like Mike Johnson, who claims to be a Christian and yet is, instigating the cover-up.
I say Mike Johnson, who is a Christian.
Right, exactly. I could just end the sentence there, I guess. But I mean, he's making an actual
blanket thing
deal with, right? He's exchanging power and money. I think. I mean, I think
he's a Christian nationalist, ultimately white supremacist. His version of Christianity aligns with all of those things, and his starting point for that is a binary gender framework in which women are subordinate to men in every public and political and powerful way. So if you start there, then it's really easy to do that to Black people and gay people and trans people and foreign people. Mm-hmm. That's just like par for the course in his thinking. And he's a Christian. And so, that goes back to the no cookies for popes.
I haven't even gotten through my first question yet. We knew this was good. We were predicting how many questions we were going to get through today. If you'd like to place bets, I'm going to say 2.
That's right.
This brings me to my next question, an actual legitimate question that I've written down here. And it's actually this. If you could, so in your book, if you could turn to page 2, please. And there is a sentence that you have written that is beautiful. I'm sorry, your note to me is in there as well. Yes. There is a sentence that is underlined.
Yes.
Well, a few, I guess. But this one, if you could just read that sentence, I want to talk about that.
Sure. And I'm going to preface this by saying that Rachel's writing on violence is incredible, and that if you haven't read it, you should read it. Because
I'm fun at parties too.
Yeah, we should sit at dinner together.
I write about violence and I'm fun at parties.
Yes, and so I think probably show of hands, do you associate violence, the perpetration of violence, with men more than women? Right? And do you associate victims of violence with men more than women?
Victims of violence?
Yes.
Do we associate victims of violence with men more than women?
Are more men or women victims of violence is really the question.
Oh.
Women. But for example, many people I think would think of war and battles and that kind of, and gun violence, et cetera.
Yeah.
So what I explain here is that male supremacy's greatest trick is convincing the world that men are the primary victims of violence when women bear its deepest, most consistent quotidian costs, which doesn't sound like this is relevant to this crew here. But in general, like I don't know about you, but I've been doing this for a long time, and if I write about any kind of injustice, I will inevitably get many people sometimes saying, war, men die in war, men are, victims. And in fact, boys all learn that they are objects of violence and perpetrators of violence because that's how masculinity works. But in fact, on a daily basis, women are navigating violence, avoiding violence from every kind of space and institution. And that's what this is about.
Mm-hmm. It stopped me in my tracks when I read that because, and I'm perfectly aware of, I know a lot about violence. I know, for example, that men have been some of the greatest beneficiaries of the feminist movement because we suddenly had shelters and we had domestic violence agencies and advocacy for women victims of violence, and they didn't have to kill their way out of their violent relationships.
Children were saved from those violent relationships.
And
intergenerationally, there was overall less violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
In those spheres.
So there was a podcast recently in the New York Times, my overlords, as I'd like to call them, by Ross Douthat. Mm-hmm.
Or doubt that.
No, I know.
No.
Well, I'm not going to put it on to no. Okay, never mind. I'm going to use my inner editor and say, don't say it out loud, Snyder. So it was called, for those of you who don't know the debate, it was called something like, did liberal feminism ruin the workplace?
Well, it started off, did women ruin the workplace? Then they changed the headline.
Yeah. Well, they do always change headlines.
Yes.
That's, and just for the record, we writers don't write our headlines.
We don't write our headlines.
So we have no choice in headlines, actually,
Right.
Very little choice. And so I brought myself to finally listen to it and watch it last night. And one of the guests who wrote, Helen Andrews, who wrote this, I can't remember what the name of the essay is for, the feminization movement or something like that. And she was writing about how women dominate in all these different areas. And I know, I'm a professor at American University. Like, it's true. I always have more women in my classes. And, so 60% of students are women. We talk about the male loneliness problem. The law schools are now 60% women. And so her sort of take on it is that while the places occupied by the levers of power are still men, CEOs, presidents, etc., she believes it's just a matter of years that those men are going to age out. And I wonder if you could respond to that.
Sure. She doesn't just believe that. She thinks that when women entered public spaces in the workplace, that they brought, this is very gender essentialist, feminine ways of being into those spaces that ruined them, that in fact threatened the rule of law.
Yeah, she talked about consensus versus, starts with C. What, when you like?
Conflict?
Conflict, I think is conflict.
It's just drivel. And I'll tell you why I think it's drivel. I read it. I read her first piece, and I'm familiar with her work. But first of all, she makes a lot of
She
these
blocked you on Twitter, right?
years ago, and I don't know why. I must have
Such
just
a badge
annoyed
of
her
honor.
because I
Such a
say
badge
things
of
like
honor.
this, right? But she lots of people have gone through and really excoriated her facts, patterns, and all of those. So I don't want to do that. But a couple of things about what you specifically said. We're journalists. Journalism schools have been a majority women for decades, almost now, several decades. And that has not affected the fundamental structure of most of media, because women will enthusiastically want to do that work, and they will go into that work, and then they will face obstacles, family care issues that we're all familiar with, bias, and then they will burn out. And about 10 years later, at 28, 29, 30, 31 years old, you just see the numbers plunge. And then you're left again with men in positions of managerial positions. And so there's no reason to believe that that will not happen in other places, and that the same fundamental infrastructure failures that we're dealing with will not affect every one of these sectors. And then the second thing is, we know that the basis, a lot of what she's saying, has to do with male flight from education. And I use those words carefully, because people say, well, we have a boy crisis, we have a man crisis in schools, boys are detaching, they're not doing well academically. But I don't really think you can talk about that until you talk about the fact that before boys started doing that, men as educators left education because it was stigmatized by the presence of women in increasing numbers, and because salaries dropped. On average, salaries in any field will drop by 30% over 10 years when women enter that field. And so men leave, and they go into other fields where they then fortress those fields against women and make more money. And so if you look at the social sciences, that is what happened, because as women became successful, as they competed, men didn't like the environment, and so they all fled to economics. And then economics became much more high status, was burnished with sort of rationality and science and, all of those things. And that was male flight. And it was a fortressing of a sector. And that happened in tech. It happens over and over again. So I don't really place much confidence in her fact linear extension arguments.
I mean, if it's any consolation, I was yelling at my computer last night. Um, it's interesting because I kept in one of the things I was yelling was like, it's not always the top echelons that I would look to. It's who's doing the caregiving, who are the nurses, who are
all
the
of it.
right. Yeah.
I mean, women are mainly still in jobs that they were in 1963. They're doing extensions of maternal work. They're, doing work that essentially make them prosthetics to more important people, usually men, as assistants, or, there are more women lawyers, there are more women scientists, but sorry, I'm gesticulating like a crazy person.
As a former
I
NPR
know,
person, I'm really
I know.
mic heavy.
There's
Yeah.
no doubt that that is happening.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a persistent pooling of women into these categories with very little movement, and it just continues. It just continues, and because it gives women more flexibility to take care of children, to do the kinds of things that we expect them to do for the society.
It's also interesting because one of the things she talks about, she sets up this kind of binary between feelings and logic, as if these are.
And that's the gender essentialism, right?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's really corrosive to everything, because first of all, it's wrong.
Yeah.
Men have feelings.
Right.
Women are logical. All of these things, and she attributes ridiculous behaviors to men and women both. And
what, like, do you remember?
well, I mean, I just think she goes in with the idea that, first of all, call out culture is just bitchy, catty women changing norms, as opposed to we would like some accountability for egregious violations that are perpetrated with institutional tolerance, and all of us can be catty and bitchy, including many men I know. So she just reduces it into this binary that is really at the heart of male supremacy. You need that binary to have the hierarchy, and then you need that binary to have the hierarchy to control the reproduction, to manage the other hierarchies based on race or sexuality or the other things, you know?
I mean, I think I feel like emotions are brought out when they're convenient. For example, if you're on a jury, if you're on a homicide jury and somebody's making a closing argument in defense of their client, they're going to try to use emotions to win that
That's right.
case. They have to. And so the idea that, like, there's no place for emotions. The other thing is, and I tell my students this, you can lie to yourself all you want in your own mind, but your feelings won't lie. In other words,
I
if you
mean,
get
our
a stomach
cognition is
ache, like,
emotional, right?
say what?
Our cognition is emotional.
Say more about that. What do
Well,
you mean?
we start off from a place of how we respond based on identity, protection, rationalizations, or strong emotions. And that physically happens in us before logic and rationality happen. It happens before those parts of our brain that use reason kick in. And so, in fact, there's a lot of great neuroscience about the fact that you can rationalize, but that's sitting on top of very visceral emotional responses and nervous system responses. And we don't like that in Western culture because it violates mind-body duality, brain-body duality. That's just the premise of our understanding of what it means to have intelligence or to be able to reason. It is that it's detached from the body. And women, of course, are associated with the body, that the body is feminized, which is why if you want to oppress someone in a society, you feminize them. And that's true of Black men. It's true of gay men. It's true of immigrants. You put them in positions physically of subjugation. You rape them, or you put them in jails where they're assaulted. Those are just ways of asserting masculine strength and power as a system and forcing people into positions of vulnerability because of their bodies. You deny them personhood.
Right, right. And we were talking backstage a little bit about the parallel of authoritarianism, the parallel of domestic abuse that we're seeing.
And Epstein.
And Epstein, yeah, right, where he's well. Let's talk a little bit about that. You made the point backstage that everything about those interactions that he's having with people was authoritarianism.
Well, and also the systems that supported his ability to do that, right? So there's a kind of highly masculinized performance of virility, and then there's probably extortion happening somewhere. There's physical control of other people's bodies. So the denial of autonomy or the denial of consent, that's all happening. There's signaling to other powerful forces who then collude, right? And so it's a kind of a microcosm. And actually, when it comes to Epstein, I think it's just more accurate to think in terms of cartels, right? Cartels run products, and the product in Epstein's case was sex with children and adolescent girls. And if you start from that premise and you think of cartels, it worked the way cartels did. And in fact, that kind of abusive power and control is very relevant to the way authoritarians work too, because they have networks that they rely on, they have violence that they rely on, they have propaganda that they rely on, they spread disinformation, and all of that is relevant to what's happening with Epstein. It's also relevant, frankly, as you said, to the way our culture thinks of domestic violence. Well, not domestic, you could talk about that, but intimate violence in general.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of false information, a lot of misperceptions, a lot of mischaracterizations.
Right.
Yeah.
We prioritize physical
We
injury
prioritize
over
physical.
all else.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we also have a tendency to think, for example, of sexual violence as stranger rapes
Yes.
instead of, I mean, most sexual assaults are perpetrated by known people, but we focus on the stranger rapes because then you can point at those very bad Black and brown men over there and make allegations that women need protecting, and then you have a whole kind of political dynamic whereby you demonize one group of men and use women and their need for protection to criminalize them or expel them from the country or build political momentum. You know, Trump did that really well over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point. This is again, I'm off my own script, but you have a stat in here about pregnancy, the policing of pregnancies, and I actually just because I'm writing about this, I just read a stat from an NIH study last night that there will be 6 million pregnancies as a result of rape in a woman's lifetime. In other words, in the span of a generation in this country, 6 million pregnancies.
It's
as a result
32,000
of
a
rape.
year.
32,000 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in states that are anti-abortion states right now, those numbers are spiking, right? Because there will be births that are unwanted and coerced and forced.
Right, right. So this brings me to, okay, well, I'll read this so that I don't make you juggle, but there's a
You're juggling.
section in here. Yeah, but I'm used to it. It's okay. There's a section in here where you're talking about abortion, and you say most people who understand pregnancy don't believe that a fetus's life matters more than that of the person carrying it. But all it takes for a system like this to thrive is a public that is too detached, too siloed, too willing to relegate abortion to a, quote, single issue, end quote, rather than the cascading loss of rights it represents. If people cared and understood that reproductive injustices are direct attacks on economic stability, access to education and healthcare, privacy, and democracy, we wouldn't be here. Can you talk a little bit about that? I just think you so brilliantly are able to connect the dots from abortion to all these other things that matter.
Well, I mean, I think again, when we think about the mind-body split, right? We have inherited an intellectual, political, philosophical worldview in which there are taxonomies of ideas and people. And we like things to be separate, and we want that separation. And part of it is you have the separation, then you can have the order, then you can have the hierarchy, then you can have the power, okay? So all of us are in DC. We all know what the political world looks like, and a big part of it is polls and surveys and public opinion and media narratives. And in the buildup to the last election, there were always these surveys about what mattered to voters, and they were more or less broken down as economic anxiety, jobs, healthcare costs, abortion, immigration, into these buckets. And those buckets, we interpret them in our brains as separate because the words are separate. They're often graphically separate in some bar chart. And it completely takes away their connections and their mutual construction of each other constantly. And yet that is how we are supposed to think about it and talk about it. And it's just magic. It's bullshit. Because a person who, for example, in this case, becomes pregnant has to think about their education. Can they work? Will they have health care? Do they have citizenship status? Every one of the other things in the siloed framework is relevant. And in each of those siloed frameworks, even if you consider them separately, whether you get pregnant or not is relevant. Whether you can end that pregnancy if it is unwanted is relevant. Whether you might die if you don't end that pregnancy. Whether you can feed your other children if you don't end that. I mean, it is ridiculous to put abortion on a list as a separate item from all of those other things. And that's one of the things that I'm writing about. And then the second thing really is nobody really is taught anything about pregnancy, and certainly not men. When I got pregnant, the first time, I was extraordinarily angry at every woman I knew for not telling me what was about to happen to me. And I was a woman, right? I had no idea. And so there's, again, separating ideas. The prevailing legal framework for considering abortion is not based on the experience of a person who has gestates. It's based on men's experience of reproduction, which takes place outside of their bodies, right? And so they're separate from their offspring. And so they say in the law, which is men's law, that there is it's like a homunculus. We're still going with the separate person in the woman's body taking up residence like she's a box, right? And that's how the law works. Every single standard for abortion is based on separation, which is a standard of men's experience of their reproduction. And that is not how we have children.
You know, it's so funny because you remind me, and when I was pregnant, I remember telling my husband at the time, like, oh, well, morning sickness, I'm just going to sleep till noon because I work at home. And so then I won't have morning sickness. And he was like, you know, it's not literal. And I was like,
What?
What?
And
I did not know. By the way, I was 39.
Oh my God.
Now, in my defense, I also thought women's breast. I learned
Yes.
when I was 11 or 12
No
that
one
this was not
tells
true.
us anything.
I thought that women's breasts. I thought one side
Yes.
was milk and one
Yes.
side was orange juice.
Oh my God.
Because that's what mothers in TV commercials gave their children.
Yes.
In my defense, my mother died when I was 8, so there were a lot of weird misconceptions I had. But
Yes.
but even that concept of morning
don't
sickness
know. You don't
comes
know.
right.
No one
I
tells
mean, I
you.
know now. Yeah.
Well, now this is
yeah.
part of the book.
My daughter's
now,
about to graduate.
Everybody knows
like, yeah.
everything.
Yes, everybody knows
everybody
everything.
knows
Yeah.
everything, and they know much more than they want to know.
But the morning sickness thing comes from male doctors who only saw their pregnant wives in the morning before they headed off to work.
Yes.
And they named it.
Morning sickness.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, every part of the women's reproductive system is named after a man.
Wait, what?
Every part of our reproductive system is named after a man. I'm not going to go into this. Go Google it.
Oh, God. Oh, really? Like uterus?
All of it.
Like a
go,
Dr.
go,
Uterus?
Go look. Fallopian tubes, Dr. Fallopian. There's a long, really entertaining, really bad list.
Oh, my God. I have so much to learn still. I'm old enough to be
You
a
want to block
grandmother.
this out. There are better things to learn.
Yeah, that's so true. Oh, my gosh. So speaking of young people, awkward transition there. But
Learning.
you said something. I was listening to a podcast that you did with someone the other day, and you had this beautiful line in there, which I have to say, as a college professor, I don't do enough, where you said the women of Gen Z should be teaching us, should be mentoring us.
I think all young people should be mentoring up.
Okay, talk more about that.
Well, I think
Because usually we think they've got nothing, they got nothing interesting to teach us.
which is wrong,
Yeah.
right? Like they have so much to teach us, and they also have learned more in a day than most of us learned in 10 years, because they are learning in this immersive, networked, diffuse media. And information, they didn't learn information linearly. They learned it rhizomatically. They hyperlinked to information. It didn't necessarily come at them slowly like it came at us. It came at high speed, very accelerated in massive quantities, and they had to learn how to learn that way. But I do think that it's given them great insights into ways of relating and being that we didn't learn. And so if you look at the protests on college campuses after October 11th for Gaza, the way those protests came to be and were organized is reflective of that. A lot of those encampments were incredibly diverse, and they were centered on notions of mutual care at the encampments. Mm-hmm. And everything about the way they were organized and framed and sustained themselves didn't really look like a lot of protests in the past. And I think it was interesting that that way of organizing and protesting is emblematic of that generation's resilience.
That is a different story than we normally get, right? Normally we get like, oh my God, the male loneliness academic epidemic,
Yeah.
you know, or what's happening to our young men? They're spending so much time in front of screens.
Well, there is something to that, but in between the first book I wrote, which was about anger, and this book, I wrote a book about resilience. And
The resilience myth.
the resilience myth, and it's about hyper-individualism in the society. And I think we don't really give nearly enough credence to the resilience of young people whose anxieties and anger are so legitimately grounded in reality that you have to say, why on earth wouldn't you feel that way? You know, expecting them not to feel the way they feel because they're looking around and seeing the clusterfuck that we've created makes sense to me. You know, and so I think that they're being resilient by finding ways of relating and living that do not conform to the ideals that we had that came from a kind of mid-20th century prosperity after the war, you know, be productive, work, go through this system, you will be rewarded. They know they're not going to be rewarded. They understand that. And so why are we supposed to pretend that they will be and that they're misunderstanding?
Yeah. So one of the, maybe I'll ask you just like one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions
Can I
from
say
the
one other
audience.
thing, though?
Yeah,
About the male loneliness crisis in the computers?
Yes.
So it is a real fact, that many people are lonely in the society, and that the rates of loneliness in men in their 20s, for example, are almost matched by women in their 20s, and often exceeded by women in their 70s or 80s, and often exceeded by women right after they have babies. And there are so many different ways to slice and dice loneliness, and yet we are hyper fixated on the male loneliness crisis. And it lives on the spectrum with the dating crisis and the mating crisis and the child production crisis. And all of them are crises of equality. All of them are the shock of women mainly saying, no, we're not doing that. We will not be extensions of you. We will not produce the babies for the war machine. We will not deplete ourselves in the following way because you haven't learned emotional competence, you know, and you can just tie them all back to some of the same basic issues.
I mean, that actually reminds me of another point that you made on this podcast, which was, and I wonder if you could talk about this a little bit, which was, you know, women are what is it, the gray divorce or something
Gray
like that?
divorce is
Gray
doubled.
divorce. Yeah. I mean, I'm a member of the gray divorce.
I mean, the rates of divorce for, I think it's women over 50 have doubled, men and women, but women are like, and women initiate 73% of all divorces, and they don't remarry.
And they don't remarry.
And they don't want to remarry.
Yeah, right.
It's not that they can't remarry, it's very often, more often, that they don't want to remarry.
And why are they getting divorced?
Well, most women will indicate some level of intimate inequality led them to divorce. And even if they will be impoverished financially by the divorce, they will still divorce. And those are just decisions they're making about how they would like to live their lives. And I think that the Gen Z dating gaps and the plus 50 dating gaps are similar in some of their fundamentals.
I feel very much like I'm looking into a mirror at myself right now. You're explaining me to me. Okay, sorry. This will be my last question. Although I have like 7 more here, but you have this interesting way of talking about protection. You're talking about both the word protect and the idea of protection. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you frame it as a very gendered word. And I thought it was really, really smart.
Well, thank you. So I had this conversation. This came to me when I was talking to a group of students It was a high school. There were about 400 kids, and we were talking about the weaponization of the internet that they were experiencing in their day-to-day lives. In this particular instance, this was a school where, which is very common, a group of boys had put together some platform where they shared pictures of girls. Everybody knew it except the adults. The girls were in class every day with these boys, and they just had to kind of keep going to school. There was no accountability, on and on and on. And so I talked about how I didn't want to talk about that in the conversation. So instead, I showed the way that continued to happen in the instance of women in politics. So almost all women in politics become the target of sexualized images, and that's used as propaganda against them. Even though it's portrayed as a personal issue, it's really mis and disinformation because it undermines voter confidence, for example. And so I used that example, and when I was finished, I took questions, and the first young man who asked me a question said, but don't you think, and I understand, I think that for men, young men in particular, it feels like an attack to say men are doing this. And he clearly felt that way. And he said, but don't you think it's men's role, it's my role to be protecting the women around me, the girls and women around me?
Mm-hmm.
Because clearly he'd gotten the memo,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is the memo. And I said, well, can we just talk about that? Because yes, you might want to do that. You might also want to protect a male friend that you're with if there's a threat. But the way you're thinking about protection is really specific to a kind of physical violence and is very specific to the way we think of men protecting women. But what if we expanded that? Because girls and women are protecting men all the time, every day. And we learn really early to de-escalate violence, to get in the way of men competing and being violent and maybe destabilizing situations. We also don't poison men every day when we're cooking, right? Like women are responsible for the bulk of food production, and women, even in intimate settings, are literally not poisoning the men who are attacking them. They are protecting their children. They're even protecting the abusive man, and yet we don't call it protection. And so the very narrow way that we think of being a protector is just legible in a very specific patriarchal way. And that mode of protection goes along with providing, right? Even if it's not physical protection, there's the protection of wealth. Mm-hmm. And that protection goes along with procreating because you've secured a woman who will do that. And that goes along with presiding. You get the power to preside if you've made this transactional exchange. And there are a lot of moderate guys running around today, like Scott Galloway, talking about this model of masculinity, and it's incredibly retrograde. There's nothing new about it. And so you have to wonder, how do we change that into a model of masculinity that is first and foremost not so objectifying of men, not making their manhood based on performance and the provision of things in return for love or purpose or meaning? And so how do you get masculinity as partnership instead of as this other model that has to rely on the vulnerability of other people?
Yeah, I remember one of my brothers saying to me once that as a man and as a father, he spent his whole life preparing for a moment that was unlikely to ever come. And I actually had never thought of it in
You mean
that way.
protecting?
Yeah.
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 And this is, I think, we didn't talk about Me Too, even though I know you had on your list, but people think of Me Too maybe as a institutional accountability, call-out culture thing. But in fact, every Me Too story involved a woman in private learning how the men around her responded to her telling her story. And most women were disappointed because most men deflected or denied or diminished or outright said, can't be that bad, you're lying. And those responses make sense because if you've been tasked with protecting this person you love and you come to the realization that you haven't been doing it and you cannot follow the women you love everywhere, to school, on the bus, to work, to a nightclub, to the beach. You can't do it. So it's already an ideal that you can never meet. You are destined to fail. And even as a girl, I learned not to tell my father and brother things because I didn't want them to feel bad and I didn't want more protections put on me and I didn't want them to go out and do something violent and stupid. And
So you were protecting them.
I 100% was protecting them, as every woman around me did, you know, and so that builds emotional fragility. And that emotional fragility is something we have to navigate around at work, in politics, in public. It's just constant.
I mean, I would, I would argue that that fragility that is responsible for most of the violence that we encounter.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
And also the fragility doubles down on the idea of male centrality, right? So even like a man on the street who's harassing you, he's demanding your attention. He's demanding your emotional, registering him emotionally and performing for him physically, you know, and he wants the centrality, and he wants it not actually because he's attracted to you, but because he's signaling to other men that he is owed it. He's performing masculinity for other men in a way that shows I can be dominant in this space. And that's a street, but then we have the guys who own the media who are doing it at scale in algorithms for billions of dollars. They're doing the same thing.
So I could ask more questions, and if no one else has questions, I will continue. But let me open it up to you all, and if you want to come to the mic, because we are recording this, I think we're live streaming it on YouTube.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for coming. This is really great. Hi,
Well,
Rachel.
thank you for coming.
Hi. You were a guest speaker in my class about opinion writing a few years ago.
So long
at a
ago.
very
Yes, I
university.
remember
Sherry
that.
Williams, my
nice to
colleague.
see you.
Right. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, so your book is about dismantling male supremacy, right? But you just now talked a little bit about algorithms and these
Yes.
tech giants. And so I have students writing about the manosphere and how they feel targeted by it because you'll click on one video and then that's all
Gone.
you'll see, right?
Yes.
And I have students writing about the trad wife trend, right? So in their minds, they are rejecting these traditional forms
Yes.
of gender, but they feel so inundated by them and they do feel affected by them. So I
Yes.
wondered if you can talk a little bit about how we're trying to dismantle traditional
Yes.
genders of male supremacy, but technology is bringing them to us at lightning speed in a different
Yes.
kind of way. So
Yes.
can you just talk about
That's
that
such a
little
great
bit?
question. And also, I write extensively about those things because for the last 10, 15 years, I've been quite immersed in the technology and its effects on society. And I think we think of technology in terms of technical acceleration and not socio-technical acceleration. And that's important because everything about technology has altered our social norms, our society, our ways of relating, and our culture. And that includes identity and identity formation. And kids today use technology and it becomes really salient to their identity formation. And so, has anyone here not heard of the manosphere? Okay, so the manosphere,
We're hipper than we look
we're
like, you know.
hipper than we look. No, but you know, the manosphere has been around for a long time. It didn't really pick up speed though until something called Gamergate in 2014. And that was a coalescing of gaming communities that were opposed to diversity and particularly women in gaming. And it was a violent global backlash movement against those two things. And the women involved, all of whom I personally know and are friends and were in that arena, were chased out of their homes, had to go into hiding, still have today security. Their parents were chased out of their homes. I mean, this was a very ugly thing. But what's relevant about that is it became the model that was picked up by Steve Bannon and Breitbart and a man named Milo Yiannopoulos as a way to recruit young men. They could see how those networks worked, and they leveraged those networks and strung them together to create the basis for what became a right-wing movement to recruit men. And that also spun itself into QAnon because the manosphere is filled with disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, conspiracy theories about women. And that ended up next door at Pizzagate, right? So there's a straight line from one to the other, and a straight line from that to the moment we're in right now, unfortunately. And so the manosphere continues to grow and is extraordinarily powerful in the media sphere. And what happens to young men is they go and they say, how can I get stronger? How can I develop financial acumen? How can I eat well? And within 6 clicks, they are being fed the most misogynistic content you can imagine. On the other side, young women who are a little late to the right-wing recruitment game are going through a similar pipeline, except their entrance is clean beauty, pure food, no vaxing, and all of those norms around femininity are really calibrated to white femininity, to being thin and pure and desirable and clean, literally clean, and not tainted by other races, et cetera. And those are working in parallel. But they are, unless we intervene, when children are very young, teach them media literacy, critical theories about what they're learning, what they're seeing, it's very easy to be sucked up into that. And that's what we're seeing. Hello.
So I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
So I'm 77, so I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody that was born and certainly gone through life. And I was just thinking how women have educated me. Like I was a nanny in 1972 for a woman that was getting her PhD at American University, and and I would listen to her talk about books she was reading and things were going. So kind of an education for me. My wife certainly is educated. My 31-year-old daughter has really educated me from the perspective of her generation. So I'm just kind of saying, so that's part of my story. My question is, could you talk about the role of religion in what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I had a whole chapter on religion, and my editor said, you have to cut this book in half, which I did. But I made sure to take the chapter on religion and weave it through all the other chapters, because it's a real topic that I have always written about. And all of our religions are patriarchal, and all of them tolerate patriarchal violence in some way, shape, or form. I mean, if you think about the Roman Catholic Church sexual crimes, those became news mainly because, in fact, boys were being assaulted. Not because girls are raped, but because boys were being assaulted. And that was followed fast, like it was just around the same time as the Penn State assault of young men, and then the Boy Scouts. And so rape became something you could talk about more publicly because boys were being assaulted. Nobody wants anyone to be assaulted. But the fact that it was boys was a real shock to the system. And as a feminist, what I saw was that people were understanding that those assaults were power. It was the power of a person with authority and control and status to do what they wanted to do to someone who had none of those things. And in that case, it just so happened in every case that it was an older man with a younger man or a boy. And it's very hard for people to wrap their brains around the fact that that is the position of most girls and women in society. And that when they are assaulted that way, it's a function of power and not the desire for sex. You know? And so I'm a secular person, and I don't have much affection for patriarchal religions. I think people can find faith and have a belief in divinity that doesn't have to institutionalize those hierarchies. And frankly, I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic schools my whole educational career, except for 1 year. I understand Catholicism. I studied religion. But that is a very authoritarian faith. It is rules-based. And like evangelical Christianity, and like the president said on his inauguration, you have men and you have women. And that is one of the first things he said. And with that, he established an order by which he would govern. And then the second thing they more or less did was erase the existence and care of trans people. You know, they just said, none of that here. And then everything follows from that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Good evening.
Hello.
So I have a 4-year-old son. This might seem a little off, but there's a connection in my head. What types of books should I read my 4-year-old son? I read Of Boys and Men by Richard
Yes.
Reeves, and
What did you think?
I actually really loved it. But I don't think he answered the question for me of what types of books teach my son how to be a man.
I would give you a different set of books than Richard Reeves would. I think that I would say to give him books written by the most diverse array of people you can find. And give him examples of women as role models, and I'm assuming that he's white, of Black people as role models, of alternative cultures that have different values. The issue of your son becomes the issue of men running the government, because most men learn to dismiss women as authorities. And so I'm a nonfiction writer. Men read less than 20% of nonfiction books written by women. When men write nonfiction, men and women read those books equally. And that's just a small example, right? We know that you're a college professor. Men will not cite women in their own field who are experts. They just erase them, right? And so the result is this epistemic monopoly where you ignore what women are saying. And that happens in every single form of media that we consume, and it happens without men even realizing they're doing it. It doesn't even register that they're not consuming information from people who do not look like them.
Can I tell you a 30-second anecdote? This is your
Yes.
night, and I hate to do this, but
Oh, go for
you made me think of, so I was teaching a freshman fiction writing class. This was years ago. I've been at American for 16 years now, so this is like in my baby teaching days. And it was 9 students, 8 were men, and there was one young woman. And the 9 that they were lovely, they're 18, 19 years old, but they all wrote like, there was one woman who got kidnapped and was a sex slave, and then her ex-boyfriend went and rescued her, and then in a show of gratitude, he rescues her, but then he has to stop for gas. And so in a show of gratitude, she has sex with him at the gas station. And there was another one where the woman she was in a few scenes, but all she was doing was either cooking or baking. And then there's a third story that I remember where there was a woman, but the man was able to identify. She disappeared, and it was his wife, and he was able to identify her based only on the like pieces of her apron that he found out in the Arizona desert. And I was like, what
is happening?
What are these young men doing? And so I was talking to a colleague of mine, and she said, you should go to the bookstore and see if they sell American University aprons and wear it into your
Oh my
classroom
God.
and see if the students
Yes.
are like, turns
Did
out,
you do
no,
it?
we don't sell aprons. But I did
Not
walk
yet.
in and I said, okay, you guys, how many of you have mothers? Right? And then I was like, now how many of your mothers do things other than bake, cook, or die at the hands of men?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was like, how many of you have female college professors? I mean, but it is this like, these were all young men who were,
They probably had
college
mothers who
educated.
worked.
Yes.
Like it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter, in
Yeah.
fact, because the entire culture is saying it's irrelevant what the women are doing. And I will say this, Richard Reeves is really big on purpose. Men have to have purpose. And I don't know why. Women, nobody says, what's a woman's purpose? Nobody asks 14-year-old girls, thousands of them.
Well, we say childbearing. They say,
We don't even say it. We don't ask because that's the purpose we have, right? And yet all these surveys, I'm on the board of Equimundo, which is a global masculinities organization trying to help boys and men redefine masculinity in a way that is healthier for everybody. But this question of purpose, I think, goes back to having to perform masculinity constantly, having it be precarious, having it been fueled by status anxiety, having to compensate when you feel that your masculinity is at risk. Those are super powerful norms in the society, and they are debilitating to a lot of boys and men. And yet we cling to this idea of purpose. I'm like, why don't we just let them be and know that they can be loved without having to perform constantly? Anyway, that's why I differ from Richard Reeves.
So we could obviously talk a lot, but we are, in fact, out of time. So
are out of
I think
time.
you will be available for signing
I will.
books.
And thank you all for coming. I know that it's in person is hard.
And I think they want you to fold up your chairs and set them against the thing. And thank you.
Yes.
Yes, the books are available for purchase at the register.